Roger, let's start with you. Both you gentlemen, if you can answer the question. The inspiration on writing this book, how did it come about?
Thanks, Carolyn. And again, thanks. I'll echo the thoughts of thanks for everybody coming here this morning and particularly for being interested in this subject, which is close to our hearts. Scott and I have done a number of stories on this subject for the Wall Street Journal over a number of years. And I guess we figured our souls wouldn't rest unless we put it all together in a book to have a narrative that would be more powerful, more comprehensive than the individual stories as they came out over time in the Wall Street Journal. What we really wanted to do, and our mantra in the course of writing the book, was to outrage and inspire. Outrage and inspire is what we wanted to do. Outrage that we brought hunger with us into the 21st century, even though the Green Revolution was one of the great accomplishments and scientific wonders and achievements of the 20th century. And not only have we brought hunger with us into the 21st century, but as Carolyn said, in ever-increasing numbers, that there's 1 billion people that go to bed hungry every night in this world. At the beginning of the 21st century, in the first decade of the 21st century, is appalling, and shame on us for that. But at the same time, to inspire that this is one of the problems, and one of the great problems of the world that can truly be overcome. That we have precedent on our side from what went on in the Green Revolution and from what most of the developed countries in the world, like the United States, have been able to do through agriculture transformation, the countries of Europe and the wealthier countries of the world. And through that have seen the great examples that individuals matter and individuals can really make a difference on this. And so what we wanted to do was inspire people to realize that everybody can get involved, can do something on this front, and that basically that ending hunger through agriculture development can be one of the singular achievements of our generation and one of the great things of this, one of the great accomplishments of this decade.
Terrific. And Scott, speak, if you will. Roger mentioned the Green Revolution, which is not about environment per se, but is about the environment of agriculture. What was it? And it was thought it was going to end all hunger. Why did it not?
So in the 1960s, famine was becoming a bigger and bigger problem in India and Pakistan and other parts of Asia. And at that time, the United States was exporting to India alone something like 20% of the entire U.S. wheat crop was being sent as food aid to India to try to prevent hunger and famine from getting worse. And that was a period when a lot of journalists and authors were writing books about the whole theory of the population bomb, that the world, if you looked at what was happening in Asia with the growing population and agriculture's inability to keep up with it, if you looked at long-term trends, it would suggest that we're heading towards a disaster, a catastrophe that would be unprecedented. And by the 1980s, the entire world would, not the developed world, but much of the developing world would be awash in famine. So there was an effort to try to address that, and it became known as the Green Revolution because the solution to the famine was found not in continuing food aid, but in trying to help farmers in India and Pakistan be more productive. And it was a coincidence, but it happened at that time that there was a man who had been working in Mexico for the Rockefeller Foundation for a few decades and had become very good at increasing the productivity of wheat and helping poor farmers in Latin America grow bigger and bigger crops on very poor soil. And he basically was able to take his seeds that he had developed in Latin America and bring them to Asia. And it was a miracle because what he did was something that conventional scientists didn't think was, mainstream science didn't think was possible. They didn't believe that seeds that were grown in Mexico could grow in India because plants are basically, breeders raise plants for a very specific region. You bred plants where you wanted the seeds to be planted. It's a long story and it's in the book, but he figured out how to trick the plants to become essentially insensitive to different climates and different latitudes. And he brought his seeds to India. His name was Norman Borlaug, who's central to the book. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970 because of the work that he did with these seeds. The term the Green Revolution caught on because it basically described the rising size of the crops. It became a controversial term later on because environmentalists would argue that it really wasn't a green revolution as they saw a green revolution, because this was a revolution that depended heavily on inputs like fertilizer and chemicals that environmentalists wouldn't agree with. So actually today, this term, the Green Revolution, is still controversial. And in Africa now, the work that's being done to develop agriculture there's a debate whether it should be called a green revolution or not, because that term from the 60s and 70s is still
but it did take real root in Asia and in Latin America, and Indira Gandhi was so moved that she ripped out her garden and planted the wheat that Norman Borlaug brought the seeds for. So, and it was a success there in alleviating much poverty. Then Norman Borlaug was approached by a Japanese philanthropist and was asked, do the same in Africa. But it didn't take. And let's talk about that, because this is really what the book is about, right?
Right. It's interesting that the Green Revolution in Asia was almost too successful. What happened was by the late 1970s, early 1980s, the productivity of India's and Pakistan's farmers had increased so much that India actually became an exporter of wheat. It didn't end hunger. There's always hunger tied to poverty, but it ended the threat of famine. So much so that by the 1980s, much of the West had become complacent about agricultural development. They didn't see famine as a worry anymore. I mean, one thing to remember is in the 1970s, when Asia was the home of the begging bowl nations, Africa in the 60s, I should say, didn't have these problems. It wasn't on the radar as a famine zone. That wouldn't come until later. So what happened is in the 1980s, the donors in the West had turned their attention away from the things that Norman Borlaug had done, and had no longer funded this kind of research into agricultural development. So by the 1980s, now Africa becomes a problem. Africa's population has exploded, and there had been little development work done, little investment in agricultural development in Africa, and their farmers couldn't keep up. So there was this, Norman Borlaug, who had had this experience in Asia and was very confident about his abilities, was the one that was, I should say, he also wasn't even aware of Africa. He hadn't thought about Africa either. He was basically heading into retirement in the 1980s when he got a call out of the blue. And that's what started him thinking about what to attack in Africa.
Right. And this turning away, so as Borlaug goes into Africa, from the Sasakawa Foundation saying, hey, can we do something in Africa? And the real trigger point in Africa was the horrible Ethiopian famine of 1984 that probably most of us in this room, and perhaps the viewers, was almost a watershed moment in terms of galvanizing the world's kind of outrage that hunger is still with us. But as Borlaug goes to work in Africa with a much less budget than the Green Revolution has, it was backed by the Rockefeller Foundation, that's where this turning away from the Green Revolution also takes place because of the success that Scott described. Borlaug won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970. India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, China, other places that were once so hungry, all of a sudden start producing surpluses. Hey, people figured, problem over. We'll move on. Different factors started to reign. Interestingly enough, and this was also one of the great motivating and inspirational points for Scott and I in writing the book and in our reporting for the Wall Street Journal, was that Borlaug was recognizing and sensing this and warned of this in his Nobel speech in 1970. Just let me read one passage from that, which really sets up what happened. Borlaug said in 1970, height of the Green Revolution, man can and must prevent the tragedy of famine in the future instead of merely trying with pious regret to salvage the human wreckage of the famine as he has so often done in the past. We will be guilty of criminal negligence without extenuation if we permit future famines. So here we are, beginning of the second decade of the 21st century, and hunger. There's more people hungry now in absolute terms than there were before the Green Revolution. Criminal negligence. I mean, it is a criminal aspect if one looks at it. So what's happened in part of that negligence is investment in agriculture development by the rich world and the wealthy part of the world two countries in the developing world, primarily in Africa, dramatically disappeared and slumped from basically $8 billion a year in the 1980s to about $3 billion a year this decade.